For all his towering stature, boldly proclaiming a mighty fortress is our God, there was much more to Reformation in the German territories than the life, thought, and activities of Martin Luther. Essentially, there were two main approaches to implementing religious change in 16th century Europe apart from the Roman Church. One course of action involved working in concert with the civil authorities or the local magistrates. This program was called Magisterial Reformation for obvious reasons. The alternative was a concerted attempt to dismiss those same authorities from any active role in matters of the faith. That implied an effective separation of church and state. Religious reform in Germany tended to follow the former tactic, and as such remains an excellent example of the Reformation within the limits of civil authority alone. Despite this general tendency, elements of radical and popular reform initiatives can be located in the German territories, the most startling and dramatic example being the outbreak of the disastrous Peasants' War of 1525. Definite triumphs and lasting defeats chart the course of Reformation in the German lands.
The word Reformation was about as popular in the Middle Ages as the word democracy is today, and it meant just about as many things to people then as the term democracy does today. Everyone was for it, as practically all of the sources attest, but that didn't explain how reformations, today we might speak of reforms, were to look and how they could be implemented. Nonetheless, my point is this: Reformation was not just cliché. There's two main approaches to the study of Reformation. A first approach is to see the Reformation in its medieval context and to regard the movements for church reform and renewal in the 16th century as essentially medieval in nature. The emphasis is placed on intellectual origins with attention to theology, philosophy, and learned spirituality. It's effectively intellectual history, looking backwards into the medieval context. One perspective in this school of thought is championed by the German historian Joseph Lürz and the scholar Étienne Gilson, who see the later Middle Ages as a period of intellectual confusion and decline. They rather see it as something kind of boring. For Gilson, the 14th century was considered journey's end. He wrote this big book on a history of Christian philosophy in the Middle Ages. And his last chapter, he ends with the 14th century, and he calls it Journey's End. It's all over with. It's all downhill from here. Another perspective within this school of thought, the Reformation in its medieval context, is typified by the late scholar Heiko Obermann. He sees this notion as erroneous, that it's intellectual decline. The late Middle Ages is not a time of waning or decline. The Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, whose great classic book from the 1920s, The Waning of the Middle Ages. Obermann would reject that. Nominalism, or the via moderna, the modern way, provides a natural bridge in approaching the Reformation from this point of view between the medieval world and the world of Reformation. It's not a time of disintegration at all. It's not a time of confusion. It is, in this school of thinking, the most fertile intellectual period of all the Middle Ages. The second approach has been to interpret the Reformation in an urban perspective. Now, in this approach, the emphasis has fallen on a contemporary urban perspective concentrating on the development of a specific city or region. It's essentially social history, with a forward view towards the establishment of modern institutions. The German church historian again, Bernd Moeller, sees the appeal of the Reformation lying in its support of late medieval communal values. Medieval cities, in fact, perceived themselves as sovereign, sacral communities with civil rights and freedoms. And some reformers, Luther being one example, held doctrines which appear to uphold these points of view and these principles. Moeller also thinks that the Reformations were most successful where they changed religious thought and practice the least. Reformation was most successful where it changed things the least. Now, that's a point worth pondering. City councils and magistrates, however, must not be seen as the initiators of religious reform in 16th century Europe. If we use the analogy of a modern automobile, the magistrates, the civil authorities, were rather like the brakes, not the motor of reform. The motor, which is what drives the automobile, the stimulus for the Reformation came from the preachers, the reformers. The magistrates tempered reform, and they controlled the forward motion, much like brakes do in an automobile. For example, in the German context, the Margrave Casimir of Brandenburg-Ansbach-Kulmbach had Protestant preachers clarify from their pulpits that the new freedom of a Christian, using the title of Luther's book, was not meant as a challenge to established political authority. To say that a Christian is free does not mean you can do whatever you want and simply abandon your responsibilities and the peasants are failing to perform their duties. In fact, in Germany, in many instances, the local magistrates, the authorities, preferred to introduce reformation, or religious change, if you will, by means of rigged disputations, which were effectively agreed to in advance. This took place in a variety of locations: Nuremberg, Zurich, Constance, and a variety of other places. It can be said, and I am speaking of the concept of magisterial reformation. It's reformation that's undertaken in concert with the civil authorities, the magistrates, hence the magisterial reformation. It can be said that in these contexts, the Protestant preachers were never very far from the centers of political power and influence. Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, Thomas Cranmer, and many others were preachers and churchmen. But they also functioned as political advisors, and they were sought out by the secular authorities on many different issues in many different ways. So you can see this notion of magisterial reformation is one where the civil authorities and the religious personalities are working together. Now, Martin Luther, as we have already learned, was the biggest name in the religious world of 16th century Germany. However, Martin Luther was far from the only thing taking place in Germany. So while not ignoring Luther altogether, because it would be quite difficult to talk about the German Reformation in the 16th century and ignore him, let's turn our attention, however, in this particular session to some other personalities and some other events in Germany which illuminate other aspects of church history at this point in time. In some ways, Reformation in Germany manifested itself as a social movement. And I want to take you to Wittenberg, Luther's hometown, 1521, 1522. The idea of movement seems predicated around events that happened in Wittenberg in 1521 and 22. Now, the background includes several points. First of all, Luther helped to stimulate a popular movement, and by popular I mean involving grassroots people, the commoners. He helped to stimulate this with his public burning of the papal bull and the books of canon law in December 1520. There were, of course, thereafter numerous debates in the University of Wittenberg sparked by Luther's ideas, these in the fall of 1521. Remember, Luther isn't even here in Wittenberg at this time. He's off in the Wartburg, kidnapped by his elector, Frederick the Wise. The practice of Utraquism, that is to say, the bread and the wine for all of the lay people, begins to be practiced, albeit privately, in September 1521 by Philip Melanchthon and his students. There are waves of new religious emphases that began to reach into the religious houses of Wittenberg, and the Augustinians, Luther's old order, cease holding private masses. Now, I'm giving you a series of building blocks of, shall we say, a process of erosion of the old traditional religion leading up to full-blown Reformation in Wittenberg. A series of public demonstrations break out in the first week of October 1521, and they appear to have been religiously motivated. These were followed by a general mass exodus from the Augustinian order in November, when the monks just simply left. Remember, Luther's not here. He's up in the Wartburg castle. In his absence, violent iconoclasm takes place and convulses the city in early December. Andreas Karlstadt publicly celebrates a Utraquist Mass without wearing vestments. On Christmas Day, 1521, he innovates the liturgy. You have to imagine that this was absolutely astonishing to lay people. To see a priest get up in the pulpit wearing ordinary clothes, saying, "Come and receive the body and blood of Christ, and don't worry if you went to confession this week." This is revolutionary. This is what Karlstadt did Christmas Day, 1521. Shocking to make these sorts of innovations. It's a clear violation of the rubrics governing the sacraments. And then he shocked everybody by getting engaged to a 16-year-old girl the next day. Karlstadt was about 40 at the time, and priests just didn't get married in the Latin Church, and he boasted he was going to invite the town council, the university, the Saxon princes, and the bishop to his wedding. Well, this likewise was revolutionary action, though it won't seem like revolution to you, but try to transport yourself back in time to the 16th century. At the height of all of this, these various disturbances, the so-called Zwickau prophets appeared in Wittenberg, ready to capitalize on the unrest and the disturbances, and they were prepared to introduce their own ideas. These were several men from the German city of Zwickau who had some pretty radical ideas about religion. Feeling absolutely overwhelmed, Philip Melanchthon, who's effectively in charge since Luther's away, begs the elector Frederick the Wise to recall Luther from the castle, this on the 27th of December, 1521. The town council decided they'd better do something, and they issued a city ordinance aimed at regulating church affairs in January 1522. In January, the local monasteries were closed, and official religion in Wittenberg appeared to be seriously threatened. Judging that matters perhaps had gone too far, the radical preaching of Karlstadt troubling, the town council put an end to it. The town council told Karlstadt and his radical cohorts that they would no longer be able to stand in pulpits in Wittenberg and preach. It was curtailed early February. Much to the delight of Melanchthon and others, though not so pleasing to the radicals, Luther returned from the Wartburg without waiting permission from Frederick. The 6th of March, and Luther preached a number of sermons which settled things down in Wittenberg. Now, these features, which I've highlighted very quickly and very briefly, are among those which helped to qualify the events in Wittenberg as a popular movement. Now, a popular movement may be defined thus: numerous people conceived as a collective group, involved in a common activity, with common goals, attempting to change the existing order, and they're engaging in immediate concerted action, and whatever they're doing is being carried out without any regard for the structures of order and authority. Well, if we take that definition, that's exactly what was taking place in Wittenberg during Luther's absence. One of the principal concerns, of course, during this time of church history was social order. Wittenberg is a good example of violent and rapid trends requiring control and the interaction of the magistrates, the city council, who step in and in this case publish rules aimed at guiding, providing some structure for the particular change. Now, there's several relevant forms of social control. An exercise of coercion, directly by force and indirectly by law, relating to peace, to order, to speech and assembly. You can have political regulations. A framework of civil order is necessary. City constitutions, guild statutes, and so on. You may have censorship of the press or even of preaching. Sermons is another form of social control. And then, of course, the regulation of public discontent, like the carnival. In order to find solid roots, the Reformation had to find communal expression. If support could be found from local authorities, then social control really wasn't a factor. But if the support couldn't be found, the movement could still develop, but within some rigid parameters. And if these restraints proved unfeasible, then challenge to the fundamental order of the social structure could ensue. Well, in some cases, in the German context, popular impulses, like those in Wittenberg, and official state policy did not coincide. Now, Saxony had been divided earlier into two regions: electoral Saxony, which at this time was governed by the elector, Frederick the Wise, Luther's protector, and ducal Saxony, which was governed by Duke George. Reform was tolerated in electoral Saxony, but it was not tolerated in ducal Saxony. Because of a widespread refusal to partake of communion in the traditional and official way, and the same to be said for confession, Duke George, after a variety of measures aimed at regulating, took to inspecting the faithful. How did he inspect the faithful? Well, tokens bearing the city arms were manufactured. In fact, we know that 3,250 brass tokens were made for the men and over 7,700 tin tokens for the ladies and the children. When you went to confession, you got a token. They were distributed. And at Easter, when you showed up to take communion, they were collected. And if you didn't have your token that you got in confession, then you didn't get communion, and it was a pretty good sign you probably had sympathies with the Reformation. Anybody failing to produce the said token would be subject to interrogation. This was one way Duke George was attempting to control the infiltration of Reformation in his territories. The German lands provide an excellent context for examining and discussing the relationship between Reformation and city authorities, or this business of magisterial reform. For example, in the imperial city of Nuremberg, the city council oversaw the affairs of the church, the convent, and the monastery, and generally followed the Reformation trends. Now the question remains, why did the Nuremberg authorities so convincingly accept the Lutheran confession? Well, the answer can be partly attributed to the fact that Reformation theology provided an explanation of human frailty, which in turn provided an ideological basis, if you will, for the experience the city council had had with social order. The doctrine of humankind set forth by the Reformers explained the practice of control of the local authorities. In this context, there was nothing in Reformation ideology or political theory which threatened the civil authorities, and hence they could in good conscience facilitate the aims of the Reformers. They didn't see anything that threatened them, so they went along with it. Reformation theory and civil administration combined a practical Machiavellian view of managing people with a grand sacred purpose, and so it just seemed to work. Now, in the midst, however, of thoroughgoing Lutheranism in Nuremberg and Zwinglianism in Zurich and Calvinism in Geneva, all of them were assisted enormously by the relevant city councils. How does one then account for the situation in Cologne, where the Reformation didn't happen at all? There was no success. Well, there seem to be at least three significant points to explaining the anomaly of Cologne. First, the town council was simply not amenable to reform. Secondly, there was a pretty strong university there, and the university was a staunch defender of traditional faith and the official church. And the faculty of theology at Cologne was utterly anti-reform, or so it seems. And thirdly, in Cologne there was a very effective program of official censorship that was put into place. So in Cologne, unlike Nuremberg and Zurich and Geneva and Wittenberg, the Reformation couldn't find the necessary institutional footing in order to get a toehold. The structure of social control was such that a basis in the commune or the guilds was impossible. Well, in other instances, Luther's direct advice aided reforms in electoral Saxony, and when Albrecht of Brandenburg, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, began to transform Prussia into a Lutheran duchy, once again, he followed the cues from Martin. The Holy Roman Empire sat in session in 1526 at the imperial Diet of Speyer, German city. And at that time, it offered the princes and the magistrates the possibility of governing church affairs with both God and empire in view. And this was a twofold initiative, and I think somewhat shrewd on the part of the empire. First of all, it was a clear indication they wanted to exercise control. I mean, if you want to exercise control in the situation, take the initiative. Be proactive, not reactive. Secondly, it was an acknowledgement, and not a very subtle acknowledgement either, that the Reformation in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire were unlikely to be curbed altogether. So it's a concession. If you can't beat them, let's join them. And if we have to join them, let's control them. And that's what the empire attempted to do. So we look here at Cranach's Saxon electors, from left to right, Frederick the Wise, whom I've mentioned, the governor, if you will, of Saxony, Luther's protector, and his successors, John the Steadfast in the middle, and to the right, John Frederick the Magnanimous. What a great nickname to have. Now, this working together of church and civil authorities is underscored again in the year 1527 when Luther persuaded Elector John the Constant, or John the Steadfast was his nickname, to undertake an ecclesiastical reconstruction under state supervision. Luther says to the prince, "I got a great idea. Why don't we reconstitute the church and religion in Saxony? I've got the ideas, and we'll use the state apparatus to carry it out." And John the Constant said, "Okay, good idea." This involved appointing visitation commissions comprised of nobles and officials and theologians to regulate both financial and personnel matters in Saxon churches. Now, can you see where I'm bringing this topic to? Magisterial reformation. Reformers working hand in hand with the government to effect religious change. There will be other models of reformation other than this that we'll consider in future lectures. This model, pioneered in Saxony at the behest of Luther, was put into place then in Brunswick in 1528, in Hamburg in 1529, in Lübeck up north in 1531, in the Duchy of Pomerania, in the Danish kingdom, in Ducal Saxony at length, and Brandenburg, at Nuremberg, and in the Margraviate of Brandenburg, Ansbach, Bayreuth. And so you've got this model spreading throughout the German territories. Reformation is being implemented with the consent of the government. Though it was not Luther's intention, and I want to be very clear on that point, this initiative led to the territorial prince effectively becoming the supreme bishop in those areas. That's not what Luther meant, but that's effectively what happened. And to this day, in the Protestant parts of Germany and in Scandinavia, Lutheranism is the state church. When your baby is born in Finland, it's Lutheran. It's as simple as that. It's a state church. This was, I think, an unintended consequence of Luther's initiative. Well, what should be said then about the governing territorial princes? Well, they were generally more remote from their populations than the city councilors. I mean, these were guys that, stayed up in the mansions outside of town, and they just didn't bother with the rank and file. Unlike the city council of Wittenberg that we discussed earlier, that had to deal with Karlstadt's radical preaching, with iconoclasm, with all of this chaos in Wittenberg. The territorial princes were closer to the empire. They feared, I submit, they feared the imperial will more than they did the people. And they tended, as we shall see, to form defensive alliances rather than taking an act in directing reform. And so rivalries would exist. Saxony is a good example. Duke George the Catholic versus Electoral Frederick. Well, he's a Catholic, but kind of looks like a Protestant. And you've got Catholics and Protestants with this rivalry, which is politically rooted as much as it is religiously and theologically. In other towns or regions, the main characteristics surrounding early reform activities tend to resemble and exhibit the features of a reformation by council. That is, a reformation controlled by the civil authorities. And again, as I have said, one of the defining features in the separation of the main streams of reform, magisterial, which is Lutheran, Zwinglian, Calvinist, and Cranmerian in England, and radical, or Anabaptist, which we will look at on another occasion. The popular Reformation, that is to say, reform developments at the grassroots level, were often communal movements, as opposed to one-person initiatives. A number of these were openly rebellious, and a lot of chaos, a lot of violence, if you will. Many were rooted in economic and political turmoil and religious change, and the Reformation was viewed as an opportunity, a possibility in which to initiate social change as well as religious change. In urban areas where the civic regime was weak, in Germany, for example, the town often capitulated to the side of Reformation. There were advantages perceived by becoming Protestant. Now, for peasants out in rural areas, outside of towns, the demands were fairly uniform. They wanted the preaching of the pure gospel. They wanted priests to be appointed by the community, not appointed by some prince who lived halfway across the land. They wanted the priest to live right there in town, not these absentee guys. They wanted a less expensive church, less ornate, less grandiose, if you will. And they wanted either the abolition or the reduction of the jurisdiction of the church courts. And some of these issues became crucial in conflicts like the German Peasants' War. Of course, the local officials, and I speak now both of religious and secular, were often not amenable to this level of change. And the political consequences of this resulted for the German lands in the Peasants' War of 1525. Well, the Reformation spread in a popular sense only in places like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. You can't really find evidence of full-blown popular Reformation movements in other areas of Europe. Well, this could be accounted for, the success in the German-speaking lands, on the basis of the quantity and the quality of German pamphlets, the large number of cities, which tended to drive reform, and the severe conflict that broke out between the Empire and the Roman Curia. In other words, between the popes and some of the political rulers in the German lands. And in these situations where the conflict comes to a head, the religious order tended to be turned completely upside down. Iconoclasm. We could tell many stories of priests being abused, chased through the streets, pelted with dung and stones, songs ridiculing the official church and its representatives were openly sung in the streets. Windows in the homes of priests would be smashed out at night. We're talking about psychological and physical harassment. Laymen would set themselves up as preachers who weren't ordained, who were not under holy orders, becoming self-appointed religious authorities in the meantime. This particular image shows a church turned utterly upside down, and if you look carefully inside, you will see a farmer celebrating the Mass, while outside the priests are forced to do the labor in the field. We have the world upside down completely. In one case, a woman, shock, horror, is reported to have actually preached in the pulpit of a church in Zwickau. Scandalous broadsheets appeared. Luther was behind a lot of this. We'll consider that in a separate lecture. At Zwickau on Fastnacht, the 28th of February, a mock hunt was actually staged through the streets. And who do you think were the prey? The monks and the nuns, of course. They were rounded up and driven into nets. This visual representation actually depicts something that did happen in Zwickau. Well, the evolution of these movements, these popular movements, forced the authorities to act in ways that ran counter, I think counter to their better judgment. Well, this implied a weakening of political control in the oligarchic and hierarchical constellations of German society. There were problems, and these problems characterized the 16th century German towns. There's a social character to all of this. I give you the example of the city of Leipzig. Recall that in Leipzig in 1519, Luther and John Eck debated. In Leipzig, Johannes Tetzel, the indulgence vendor, faced strong opposition to his trade, and he did not, we are told, did not dare to venture out of the Dominican house, so fearful was he for his safety. John Eck, who boasted that he'd won the debate over Luther, was mistreated. Threatening broadsheets appeared against John Eck. Abusive letters were sent to him. Every day he went out and opened his mailbox, and there was hate mail in the mailbox. Popular social implications. People were singing satirical songs against him in the streets. He was forced, we are told at length, to hide in a chimney, and he fled Leipzig under the cover of night. Well, in instances such as these, the Reformation was really less a matter of doctrine than it was of working practical belief. So the essential characteristics of a movement are in fact shaped significantly by social factors. But when the Reformation passed into the hands of the burghers and the lords, essentially the government, confessions of faith were drafted. Territorial organization of churches became codified. Priests were ordained properly according to the good, right, and proper rubrics, and new church courts were established. So when you move from popular to government, there's a formalizing of reform, and Reformation takes on a new dimension altogether. Another social context in which the Reformation in Germany plays a role was the Knights' War. Now, the German knights were the casualties of economic and political developments at the end of the Middle Ages. Over time, this noble institution of medieval men had become impoverished and disempowered. In the Middle Ages, to be a knight was a sign of prestige in many cases. But by the end of the Middle Ages, they were impoverished, disempowered. And instead of having castles and land holdings, they became mobile communities. They became known as the robber knights by sheer economic necessity. One of the events was the Franz von Sickingen affair, in which they loaned Charles V money, the Holy Roman Emperor. They weren't repaid. There were bad campaigns that went disastrously for the knights. They attacked the city of Trier in western Germany and lost, and the knights were suppressed. And then Ulrich von Hutten, one of the best known and keen supporters of the Reformation, he died, as did von Sickingen himself, who I mentioned earlier. This broke the back of their struggle. However, I have to say they were among the first to warm to Luther's ideas among the old feudal classes. Well, there's a number of key developments and key events in the German Reformation. First of all, I think I would take you back to 1521, to Luther's stand at the Diet of Worms. Here I stand. And that was a decisive watershed, turning point in the German Reformation. There were the popular movements at Wittenberg, which I've spoken of, and elsewhere. A third event that I would mention is the German Peasants' War of 1525, which I have not spoken to in any detail. The Augsburg Confession that we've heard about, which dates to 1530, where the German princes presented the confession to Charles V. This confession was a summary of the new evangelical faith that the German princes, having adopted and willing to support, were now prepared to defend to the emperor. The Augsburg Confession had been commissioned by Elector John the Constant. Now, it had been written by theologians like Luther and Philip Melanchthon and Johannes Bugenhagen and some others, but consultation had been held with the Saxon chancellor, with the bishop, with the imperial secretary. The confession was approved in the end by Elector John the Steadfast. Now, once again, this is a wonderful example of magisterial reform. The reformers and the government working together to effect religious change. Philip, the Landgrave of Hesse, and George, the Margrave of Brandenburg, also approved this particular confession of faith along with John the Constant. And it is the first Protestant confession or official declaration of faith. Another event, another institution that needs to, in fact, be mentioned in our discussion of the Reformation in Germany is the so-called Schmalkaldic League, which dates to 1530. The Schmalkaldic League was an organization, a defensive initiative, a defensive alliance of these Lutheran evangelical princes who amalgamated, formed this league to defend their religious interests in the event of a war by their Catholic enemies. Among the members were the aforementioned Elector John the Steadfast, Philip of Hesse, and the cities of Strasbourg, Ulm, Constance, Reutlingen, and a variety of others. Now, both of these developments in 1530, the Augsburg Confession and the formation of the Schmalkaldic League, I think have to be regarded as a direct result of political presence in the movement for religious reform. I mean, both of them are right there. The Schmalkaldic League is political, and the Augsburg Confession is commissioned by a prince, approved by a prince, and the theologians are consulting with civil authorities. Can you see, can you appreciate the very close relationship between church and state in 16th century Germany? Now, I have to tell you that the progress of the German Reformation, if it was not halted, was certainly inhibited 1 year after Luther died. In 1547, there was the outbreak of the Schmalkaldic War. The princes who'd amalgamated 17 years earlier and formed the Schmalkald League had done so perhaps with a premonition, because they went to war in 1547. The League was perceived as being in clear opposition to the empire, and in the spring of 1547, the imperial armies of Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, went to battle in what is called the Battle of Mühlberg, which is a town between Dresden and Torgau, and Charles defeated the Schmalkaldic League. The Saxon elector John Frederick the Magnanimous was taken prisoner by Charles, and as a result of this disastrous defeat, the capture of the Saxon prince, the League was dissolved. However, that did not end the Reformation. It did put up a pretty good roadblock in terms of progress, but despite the victory at Mühlberg over the breakaway Schmalkaldic League, if you will, Emperor Charles V, for all of his acumen and ability, was unable to undertake a political restoration of Catholicism in the empire. And so he won the war, but what did he have to show for it? I guess the head of John Frederick the Magnanimous. No, he did not kill John Frederick, but he was certainly reduced when the prince is taken captive. So the Lutheran Reformation is established permanently outside the empire only in Scandinavia, in places like Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. Despite these setbacks, despite the various limitations that the German Reformation came up against, especially after the death of Luther, a watershed development was reached with the publication of the Peace of Augsburg, 1555. And there's a very important principle that the Peace of Augsburg, which signified calming of relations between Catholics and Protestants, but the principle is whoever's land it is, then that's the religion. Now what that means is this. If we're talking about electoral Saxony, well, John Frederick the Magnanimous is Protestant. He's Lutheran. The principle of the Peace of Augsburg, then, is that because the prince is Lutheran, this is a Lutheran territory. If we skip across the river here into Ducal Saxony, Duke George is Catholic. Therefore, this area will be Catholic. We will not tolerate Protestants going over here into Catholic Germany attempting to convert. And we will not tolerate the Catholics coming into our area and trying to make it Catholic. Now, if you're a Catholic living in a Protestant area and you don't like it, that's fine. You're absolutely free to leave. We will not prohibit you from leaving. So the principle is very important. Whoever's land, that's the religion. Well, there are 6 essential components, I think, to the magisterial Reformation. First of all, this reform initiative between princes and preachers was effectively an urban culture of print and humanism. It featured the preachers, and it featured their sermons. Surprisingly, perhaps you may find that the mendicant orders were very important. Now, this is on account of the fact that the mendicants did a lot of preaching in late medieval Europe. Their houses, I'm talking about Franciscans and Dominicans and some of the other mendicant orders, their houses were a center of influence upon lay piety. Many reformers had in fact been mendicants before they became reformers. And the reading of Reformation literature in these houses was absolutely rife during this time. And so there's a subtle influencing, and these mendicants become Protestants, and they've already got this backlog of learning and influence to take along with them. Fourthly, and without speaking in detail to it, the development of church constitutions, especially in the German territories. A fifth essential component are the relevant social and legal structures which gave rise and facilitation to the whole idea of Reformation in Germany. And finally, I would note in these components the collaboration between the cities and the territorial princes. Now, it's important to point out that in some cases, magisterial reformation, like in England and Scandinavia, were acts of state. We will not be considering Scandinavia, but we will be considering England in a separate lecture, and we will find on that occasion that the Reformation there was utterly a legal act of state. It was imposed by the prince, in this case Henry VIII and Edward VI. It's a creation of the English monarchy, a creation of the princes in Scandinavia. So England and Scandinavia, as magisterial reformations, go well beyond what I'm speaking of here in terms of magistrates and reformers working together in the German territories. And as such, they constitute a separate topic altogether. Well, for the German territories, the religious Peace of Augsburg of 1555 marks the height of magisterial reform. This document was the consensus of the estates of the empire, and that consensus was to espouse the Augsburg Confession 25 years earlier, thus legally recognizing and giving protection to the magisterial Reformation. After 1555, you would have had to have had a full-blown war initiated by the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor, because Charles V will abdicate the throne and be succeeded, so it will have to be Philip II of Spain to come in and say, okay, we're just going to go to war over this. And it would be very difficult to do because there's now legal recognition for the existence of Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire. Several comments now in conclusion. The idea of the Reformation in the German lands as an urban event, I do feel is exaggerated. A.G. Dickens and the rest notwithstanding. They make a good case, but I think it's exaggerated. The cities did lead, no question about that, but only at certain times and only in certain ways. And again, I give counsel that the study of the context is so important rather than general conclusions. The early Reformation, I'm going back now to Luther, was not a political business. It was a social development, not entirely, and it was not just an urban event. I would argue strongly that the early Reformation was chiefly a theological event, and it's very important for us not to lose sight of that. Yes, there are politics and economics and social issues and so on and so forth, but the Reformation was essentially a theological event. And here it is instructive, I think, to take into full consideration the late medieval context of the European Reformations of the 16th century. To fail to do so is to run the risk of caricaturing the Reformations, of misrepresenting, and in the end, misunderstanding the basic fundamental thrust of religious reform in the days of Luther and his colleagues. And finally, it may be useful to recall what Emperor Charles V said upon his retirement when he was asked to identify the greatest mistake of his 35-year imperial career as Holy Roman Emperor. And his answer to that query was to say that his greatest blunder was honoring the safe conduct given to Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms in 1521. For who knows what might have happened had Luther been seized and had suffered the fate of medieval heretics. But Charles kept his word for whatever reason, and the Christian Church experienced as a result deep and lasting reformation.